Jake Sullivan had seen his fair share of brutal winters in the mountains, but this storm was different. The wind roared through the trees like a living thing, shaking the walls of his remote cabin as snow piled higher by the second. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. But even its warmth couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in Jake's chest. Something felt off. He had spent years alone up here, living off the land, hunting when he needed to, chopping wood, and embracing the silence that city folk would probably find unbearable. But Jake loved it. The isolation wasn't loneliness. It was freedom. And yet, tonight, with the storm howling outside, the weight of that solitude pressed on him more than ever. Then he heard it, a sound barely audible over the wind, but distinct, enough to jolt him upright. A howl, faint, distant, but unmistakably desperate. Jake frowned, standing up and moving to the window. He squinted through the thick glass, but the swirling snow made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. He held his breath, straining to hear again. There it was. A second howl, weaker this time. A dog. Jake grabbed his coat without a second thought. It didn't matter that the storm was in full force, or that stepping outside now was dangerous. If an animal was out there, it wouldn't survive long. He threw on his boots, wrapped a scarf around his face, and yanked open the door. The wind hit him like a freight train, immediately numbing his exposed skin. The cold was brutal, biting through his thick layers as he trudged forward, boots sinking into the deepening snow. The howling had stopped. For a moment, he hesitated. Had he imagined it? Was it just the wind playing tricks on him? He turned in, a slow circle, scanning the endless white, but there was nothing. Just snow, trees, and the storm swallowing the world whole. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard something else, not a howl this time, a faint muffled whimper. Jake's heart pounded as he followed the sound, pushing through the knee-deep snow, his breath coming in short, icy bursts. And then he saw it, a hole in the snow, deeper than it should have been, as if the ground had collapsed under its own weight. He stepped closer and peered down. At the bottom of the hole, half buried in the snow, was a German shepherd. The dog wasn't moving much, its body curled in on itself, barely breathing. Its fur was coated in frost, and Jake could see the way. Its ribs moved with shallow, weak breaths. "Hang in there, buddy," he muttered, dropping to his knees. He reached down, careful not to startle the poor thing, but the dog barely reacted. That wasn't a good sign. It was freezing to death. Jake moved quickly, sliding into the hole and scooping the dog into his arms. The animal was heavier than he expected, its body limp against him. He could feel the faint rise and fall of its chest, but it was too weak to even lift its head. "We're getting you out of here," he promised. The wind fought him with every step as he climbed out of the hole, carrying the dog against his chest. His legs burned with effort, and his breath came in sharp gasps. But he didn't stop. There was no telling how long the dog had been out here. Every second counted. By the time he reached the cabin, his arms were shaking from the cold and exhaustion. He kicked the door open, stepping inside and shutting out the raging storm behind him. The heat from the fire was an immediate relief, but the dog in his arms didn't react to the change in temperature. That worried him more than anything. Jake laid the German shepherd down on a thick blanket near the fire, rubbing its fur to create warmth. The dog let out a weak whimper, but didn't try to move. "Come on, stay with me," Jake murmured, grabbing another blanket and wrapping it around the animal. He moved quickly, setting a pot of water on the stove to warm up. Hypothermia was a real threat. He needed to get this dog's body temperature up, but not too fast. If he wasn't careful, The shock could do more harm than good. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside, and Jake kept working, drying the frost from the dog's fur and whispering words of encouragement, even though he wasn't sure if the animal could hear him. Then something changed. The German Shepherd stirred. Its breathing, once shallow and weak, grew steadier. Its ears twitched slightly, and then, slowly, it opened its eyes. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "There you go, buddy." The dog blinked, its dark brown eyes locking onto Jake's. For a moment, there was only silence between them, a quiet understanding, a moment of relief. But then, the dog did something strange. It tried to stand, but not in a panicked or frantic way like most animals would after being rescued. No, this was different. The dog moved with purpose, as if it suddenly remembered something urgent. Jake reached out to steady it, but the German Shepherd ignored him. Instead, it took a few shaky steps, then turned toward the door. Its ears perked, its body tensed, and then, before Jake could process what was happening, the dog let out a deep, guttural growl. Not at him, at the door. Jake felt a chill crawl down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. The dog, moments ago, barely clinging to life, was now standing stiff, its fur bristling, eyes locked on the wooden door, as if someone, was out there. Jake swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He listened. At first, all he could hear was the wind, the storm, the usual sounds of the wilderness. But then, a sound, faint, almost undetectable beneath the howling wind. Footsteps. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, with the storm making travel impossible, someone was outside, and whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood frozen, eyes locked on the door. The wind outside howled, rattling the cabin walls. But that wasn't what made his breath hitch in his throat. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunched against the thick snow just beyond the threshold. Someone was out there. The German Shepherd didn't move, its body stiff, ears perked, eyes fixed on the door, as if it could see straight through the wood. Its low growl rumbled deep in its chest, steady and unshaken. It wasn't fear. It was warning. Jake swallowed, forcing himself to think. His nearest neighbor was miles away, and with the storm this bad, no one should have been up here. Anyone caught outside would have frozen by now. So why was someone walking around in the middle of a blizzard? The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows against the walls. He glanced at his hunting rifle, propped up in the corner of the room. He never needed it for more than hunting. But right now, the weight of its presence felt different, reassuring. Then, the sound outside stopped. Jake held his breath. The dog's growl quieted, but its posture remained tense. Seconds passed. Nothing. No more footsteps. No knock. No voice calling out. Just silence. Then, a loud thud against the door. Jake's body jolted as his heart leapt into his throat. The dog barked sharply, stepping forward. Every muscle in its body coiled and ready. Jake took a slow step toward the door, his mind racing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady, despite the way his chest tightened. No response. He exchanged a glance with the dog, whose ears twitched but stayed locked on the door. Then, after a long, tense pause, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were moving away, fading into the storm. Jake exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding his breath. He waited a few more seconds before finally stepping towards the door. He hesitated, then slowly reached for the handle. his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He turned it just enough to crack the door open, peering outside. Snow whipped violently in every direction, thick and blinding. His porch was already buried beneath fresh powder, but his eyes went straight to the ground, scanning for tracks. They were there, deep footprints leading up to his cabin, and then turning away, but something was wrong. The pattern of the steps didn't make sense. The prints leading toward the cabin were clear, pressed deep into the snow, but the ones leading away, they seemed shallower, almost like his breath caught, like whoever had been standing there had left much lighter than they arrived. A shiver ran down Jake's spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. He shut the door quickly, locking it behind him. The dog watched him closely, eyes sharp and alert. Something wasn't right, and deep down, he knew this wasn't over. He crouched down beside the dog, running a hand gently along its back. "Guess we both got lucky tonight," he murmured. The German Shepherd turned to look at him, and for the first time, there was something strange in its gaze. Not just gratitude, not just relief, recognition. Jake frowned slightly. "You belong to someone, don't you?" The dog didn't react, but something about its presence, the way it had fixated on the door, the way it hadn't cowered in fear, but had instead stood ready, made Jake sure this wasn't just a lost pet. This dog had been trained, but by who? And why was it all the way out here, alone in the middle of a snowstorm? Jake sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed to think. He'd spent years in these mountains, and nothing like this had ever happened before. People didn't just show up out here, and yet, tonight, not only had he found a freezing German Shepherd, trapped in the snow, but now there were footsteps. Footsteps that defied logic. Right outside his cabin, the storm raged on, wind screaming against the walls. He tried to shake, the unease creeping into his chest, but it wasn't easy. Something about all of this didn't sit right. The dog curled up on the blanket, still alert but finally resting. Jake watched it for a moment. Before standing and moving toward the window, he wiped away some of the fog that had gathered on the glass and peered outside. The snow was falling so thick that he could barely see past the porch, but his eyes locked onto something just beyond the tree line. A shape, faint, unmoving. Jake's stomach tightened. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was there. A dark figure, standing motionless in the storm. Watching. He blinked, and in the split second, his vision reset. The figure was gone. A sharp knock echoed from behind him, this time from the back door. Jake turned sharply, every nerve in his body firing. The dog lifted its head, ears perked once more. His cabin only had one entrance, the front door, but the knock had just come from the back, a door that didn't exist. Jake's breath hitched. The knock had come from a door that wasn't there. His cabin only had one entrance, the front door, the one he had just locked. But he had heard it, clear as day, a knock, right behind him. The German Shepherd was on its feet now, standing beside him, ears pointed straight up. Its body was tense, ready. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, everything was still, too still. Jake turned slowly, his heart pounding. His cabin was small. There was no way anyone could be back there. No hidden doors, no other entrances, just solid walls. He took a slow step forward, hand tightening into a fist. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady, but his pulse was racing. Silence. The dog let out a low growl, staring at the same spot on the wall where the sound had come from. Jake hesitated, then reached for the lantern sitting on the table. He lifted it, letting its glow spread through the cabin. Nothing. Just wood. Just walls. Just. The knock came again. Jake sucked in a sharp breath. But this time, it wasn't from the back wall. It was at the window. His head snapped toward it, and his stomach twisted. The frost-covered glass showed only snow and darkness beyond. But just for a split second, he thought he saw something move, a shadow shifting outside. The dog barked loudly, its body lowering into a defensive stance. Jake moved quickly, grabbing his coat and yanking open the front door. The storm slammed into him, wind biting at his skin, snow stinging his face. He stepped out onto the porch, lantern held high. His boots crunched against the fresh snow as he scanned the tree line. Nothing, just the wind howling through the trees. But then, there, footprints, leading up to his cabin. Not his own, not the ones from earlier. New ones, and worse. There were no footprints leading away. A cold feeling settled deep in Jake's chest. Someone had walked up to his cabin, but they hadn't walked away. The dog was at the door now, watching him closely, its breath visible in the freezing air. Jake swallowed hard, then stepped off the porch, following the tracks carefully. They led just a few feet away from the cabin, and stopped, completely. The wind howled louder, the snow swirled, and then Jake heard it, a voice, soft, faint, coming from the trees. "Help me!" Jake froze. The voice was weak, broken, barely above a whisper. He turned toward the sound, his grip tightening on the lantern. "Who's out there?" he called. No answer. Just the wind. Just the storm. But something in his gut told him he wasn't alone. Then movement, a flicker of motion between the trees. Jake took a step forward. The dog barked, sharp and urgent, as if warning him. But Jake had to know. He had to see. He moved closer, his boots crunching through the snow, his breath thick in the frozen air. The lantern's glow stretched just far enough to illuminate the edge of the trees. And that's when he saw it. A man. Or at least, what used to be one. His face was pale, his skin frostbitten, his clothes torn and covered in ice. His eyes were wide, distant. He stood there, unmoving, half buried in the snow, as if he had been standing there for days. Jake's breath hitched. "Hey, do you need help?" he asked, stepping closer. But the man didn't move. Then, the dog let out a sharp bark, lunging forward. It stopped right in front of Jake, blocking his path, growling deep in its throat. Jake tried to step around it, but the dog wouldn't let him. And that's when Jake saw the footprints again, the ones leading up to his cabin. They matched the man's boots. His stomach twisted. That meant Jake took a slow step back. His heart pounded. He looked back at the man, still unmoving, still staring. And then the lantern flickered. For just a second, the light dimmed, casting deep shadows across the snow. And in that brief moment, the man disappeared. Gone. No movement, no sound. Just empty space where he had been standing. Jake's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, rushing back toward the cabin. His breath coming fast and shallow. The dog was right at his side, moving quickly, urgently, as if it had known all along. He reached the porch, stumbling inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands were shaking as he locked it. His breath ragged. The fire flickered, casting warmth against his frozen skin. The dog sat beside him, panting, watching him closely. Its eyes were sharp, knowing. Jake didn't speak. He couldn't. He just stared at the door, listening to the wind outside, to the storm that had swallowed everything. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The German Shepherd had saved him. Not just from the cold, not just from the storm, but from something else. Something that had knocked on his door. Something that had left no footprints in the snow. Something that had whispered for help, but was never really there. Jake reached down, running a hand over the dog's thick fur. It had been out there for a reason. It had survived for a reason, and maybe, just maybe, it had found him for a reason too. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time that night, Jake felt safe.